and debates, as always, as it continues to be. So inevitably we're back on Brexit this week, and asking the question about yesterday's vote, where I was one of about 60 members of the ERG who abstained, and a number of pro-Europeans on the Conservative benches abstained too. I actually sat on the bench having a jolly chat with Ken Clarke, who, though I disagree with him on many things, it has to be said, is one of the most civilised and engaging members of the Conservative Party, and doesn't take differences of opinion as a personal slight. So we sat there chewing the cud, so to speak, whilst the government lost the vote on the motion that was in itself rather an obscure motion, because it said it welcomed the Prime Minister's statement and reiterated its support for a motion that had been passed a fortnight before. And in the glorious obscurity of parliamentary procedure, people took the trouble to read what that motion had said. And that motion had said that we were in favour both of replacing the Irish backstop, but also of ruling out the possibility of leaving without a deal. And for people of my way of thinking, removing the prospect of no deal is the silliest thing you can possibly do in a negotiation. In all negotiations of any kind, whether they be grand matters of state or whether they be buying shoes in a bazaar, you want to be able to walk away and say, no, I'm not going to pay the price for what you're offering me because it simply isn't good enough. And people who don't do that find that they get a bad deal. And so as this was referring back to the prospect of removing no deal altogether, I wasn't able to support it, and nor were many others, hence the government's defeat. And the question is, does this damage the government's negotiating position or strengthen it? In my view, it strengthens it, because the suggestion that Parliament would not accept no deal, indeed would try to overturn two laws passed, ruling out remaining in, laws that said we would leave on the 29th of March, come what may. If Parliament was proposing to do that, that would have been absolute manna from heaven for the European Union. They would have been opening the champagne corks at the thought that we would accept whatever it was that they wished to tip down our throats as if we were foie gras geese, which they're very keen on in Brussels, I believe, and particularly in Strasbourg. So we thought that we helped the government, we thought we strengthened the government's position, but also backed what the country voted for. And one thing that worries me very greatly is that there are forces within the House of Commons that want to delay Brexit. And what they mean by delay is actually stop. They are people who never liked the result in the first place, campaigned for Remain, and now wish to defy the British electorate. And I think this is not only wrong because it goes against democracy, but it's a very high-risk strategy. The UK has been very fortunate in avoiding extremist parties. Throughout our history, we have tended to have moderate parties of the left and the right, and the Lib Dems wherever they might be. If we stop Brexit, if by some parliamentary legerdemain we manage to delay and prevent Brexit, I think that will be an opening for extremists. If you had European elections, my guess is that Tommy Robinson would do extremely well, and that would upset the balance of reasonableness that this country has normally been able to enjoy. Anyway, I welcome your calls as always. You know the numbers to call now off by heart. 0345 60 60 973, text 84850, or tweet at LBC. And I'm very glad to say that we have got a new caller, Gemma in Wing. Gemma, welcome. First of all, will you tell me, where is Wing?
Wing is on the very borders between Buckinghamshire and Bedfordshire, on the Buckinghamshire side of the border.
Well, a very civilised place to be. I was in Buckinghamshire yesterday for question time in Aylesbury.
I know you were. I brought my 15-year-old daughter along. We had been very sad not to get tickets, not to be selected for question time tickets.
Oh, thank you for
I brought
calling.
my daughter along to the... Sorry?
I saw your tweet, and you were intimidated by the protesters. Is that right?
They weren't being violent. They were a little invasive, and their costumes were a little intimidating. I'm no snowflake. I dealt with it. I think my daughter was perhaps a little more shaken. I was more concerned that it was very hard not to appear to be one of them. And we stuck it out at the stage door. I had promised my daughter that we would go to the stage door and try to meet you. And obviously we should have realised it had become apparent that it wasn't an environment where you could linger and chat. And I was very fearful that I had added to the intimidating environment, and you might not have realised that there was a friendly voice in the crowd.
Well, thank you. Now, I normally try and stay and chat to protesters, but there was a sort of lunatic dressed up as the devil who was trying to throw himself in front of the car as I was leaving, and that made it rather difficult to engage. But would you and your daughter like to come and have tea with me in the House of Commons? Because I'm sorry we couldn't meet, and I'm sorry that disruptors made that impossible just to say hello. And if you could get in touch with my House of Commons office, and you can get details on the website, I'd be really pleased to see you both.
Oh, that's extraordinarily kind. Can I let my daughter answer that?
Yes, of course, if she's there. Hello.
I would love to.
Oh, that's
Thank you.
splendid.
Thanks so much.
No, it would be a privilege, and I'm sorry that you didn't get tickets to Question Time, which actually had a very balanced audience. It was a fair audience with both sides pretty well represented, but it would have been nice if you'd got in. What are your thoughts on whether the ERG
panel as well?
So it was yes, we had more Leavers than Remainers, which I think is something of a first. Anyway, it was very balanced,
Definitely.
and I'm very impressed by the new presenter. I thought Fiona Bruce kept us all in pretty good order, taking over from the legend that is David Dimbleby.
Very big shoes to fill, but she's doing a great job.
Anyway, we are digressing. I feel like a schoolmaster who is taking a class, and instead of talking about Latin declensions or whatever, we've gone on to something else. So I want you to answer the question of, do you think the ERG was right to abstain in the vote and defeat the government, or should we have just gone along with whatever Mrs May wanted and sucked it up?
No, to a certain extent, if you think it is the right thing to do, I take faith in that, Jacob, because I think, well, it gives me great heart during moments of Brexit-related despair to think that you are, hopefully, one step ahead at every juncture. I think anybody trying to take no deal off the table doesn't want a good deal. They can only be trying to thwart Brexit. It is a fundamental strategy of negotiating that you have to be able to walk away. And so the suggestion that no deal should be removed from the table is simply preposterous.
Well,
so abstaining from the vote and not just appearing to block the government, to vote against the government at every point, in conjunction with the Malthouse Compromise and actually proposing a sensible way forward, I think was very much the thing to do.
Well, thank you very much. I think I'm going to enjoy that cup of tea when you come and see me in the House of Commons. I think it's going to be very agreeable, and thank you for calling. I hope you'll call again. I'm now going to go to Brian in Crewe. Brian, what's your thought? Do you think the ERG was right to abstain?
I think they were right. I think that the Malthouse Compromise is the best alternative to no deal, but I'm concerned that the Malthouse Compromise is not the preferred option by the government, because clearly yesterday the Brexit Secretary was saying that it wasn't the preferred option. Unless it is, then it must be no deal.
Well, I agree with you. I think the Malthouse Compromise is an option that people can rally around and works, that it means that we leave and that we leave with a deal that smooths out the departure. And it's really disappointing that the government hasn't grasped it, because if the government were to take it on board, then I think we would be getting somewhere. So I entirely agree with you, and thank you for your support. Now going to go to Nick in Camden. Nick, what are your thoughts on this issue?
Oh, hello, yes. Hello, Mr. Rees Mogg. Yes, I just wanted to pick you up on that analogy that no deal is a bit like buying something in a bazaar or not buying something in a bazaar. Because the big difference is that if you buy shoes in a bazaar and you walk away, then basically nothing happens. You just go to the next shop.
Well, you might not have any shoes. It might be most uncomfortable.
Yes. Well, maybe yes, but if we do no deal, then absolutely everything happens, because we're not going back to the status quo. We're going back to a totally and radically different situation, aren't we? So I don't think that's a good analogy, really.
Well, we're in a different position if we remain in, aren't we? Because the European Union has changed and is changing and is becoming a deeper union anyway. There's no such thing as the status quo in EU terms.
Well, the status quo is where we are now. It might change over time, yes. But I mean,
but it's been changing since we voted to leave.
The reason why we have to rule out no deal is because that's what brings in the radical big change, which we all need to, avoid at all costs.
Well, the radical big change surely is leaving the European Union, and that's what people voted for. Anyway, I'm afraid the clock is against us because it's coming up to 1:15, but thank you for calling. You're listening to Jacob Rees Mogg on LBC. It's now 6:15 and time for the news headlines with Lisa Aziz. Well, welcome back to Somerset. The question we're asking tonight was, are most of the ERG right to abstain from the vote yesterday? Did we strengthen the Prime Minister in Brussels, or did we weaken her position? And we've had a number of tweets and texts coming in. Anton says, I think you've strengthened the PM in Brussels, as it shows the EU that we can and will leave with no deal. But Shiona disagrees. She's quite critical and says it was the wrong thing to do. You're one of a number of MPs who are destroying the Tory party and our country. But Mary says keep no deal as an option. It's the only negotiating point we have that EU doesn't want. And Melody, no delay and no deal are the best options now. But we've got a caller. We've got Martin in Loughborough, who is a new caller, and is represented by Nicky Morgan, who's been a key participant in discussing the Brexit, the Malthouse Compromise over Brexit. So, Martin, very interested in your views. Do you think we were right, or have we messed it up?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say, Jacob, is I've watched you now numerous times on the TV, YouTube clips I've shown my mates at work, and we all love the way you never get flustered. You put your point across, and the people that you put it across to in the end, you just, we will use the word, you own them in the end, and that's brilliant. And I hope, just before I carry on, I hope one day you're the leader of this country, because we need someone like you as Prime Minister. Getting back to the point in question about the ERG, I think they do well as a party on their own. You've strengthened the Prime Minister's hand now when she goes to Brussels, because Brussels have known for the last 2 years that they're dealing with a Prime Minister who, from the start, voted Remain and wants to. She wants use the analogy half in, half out. She wants that. She wants to still be tied to the EU, and the ERG. I think they're brilliant because they're making her hand stronger in Brussels. They're knowing that they will know now that the UK are not going to mess about. If no deal's still on the table, then they're not going to let us go away with no deal. They want that 39 billion, which you say is the same as me. I wouldn't pay it, but they want that 39 billion pound, and they're going to come up with a last-minute deal that's going to please us in the end, I believe.
I think you're probably right. I think they're desperate for the money, and if you look at economic growth figures at the moment, Germany, France, Italy are all either in or heading into recession. The UK is growing faster than all of them, and this often our economic performance gets blamed on Brexit, but in spite of Brexit, we're still doing better than all of them, and I think they want a deal more than we do. So I agree with you. And what the ERG is trying to do is stick up for the Conservative Party manifesto that we said we would leave the European Union, leave the customs union, and leave the single market.
Yeah, you see, as you know, our MP here in Loughborough is Nicky Morgan, and she is an ardent Remainer as well. I mean, the last few weeks, she's changed course a little bit and gone into this Malthouse Compromise with you and a few others. And, at the end of the day, will the EU listen to that?
I think it's in their interest to, and your MP, Nicky Morgan, has been very impressive in the Malthouse Compromise and has persuaded people like me to compromise on certain things, and Steve Baker, and she has been willing to compromise on the Irish backstop. And I think that's the way to unite the country. I think the way she's shown a good deal of leadership in that and courage, because it's not always easy to compromise. The people who compromise often end up being criticised from both sides. And I must confess, I think she's been both impressive and brave, but has also extracted some concessions from the other side. So she's been effective from her point of view too. So I think you're lucky to have her as your Member of Parliament. Anyway, thank you so much, and thank you for your support. I'm going to go to Elfie and Caterham. Hello.
Oh, hi, Jacob. How are you?
Well, thank you, and thank you for calling.
I just wanted to start by asking you, a couple of years ago, before the referendum, you put out a tweet saying that there shall be 2 referendums, one before we get the deal and one just after. So I'm wondering why you're changing your mind now to fall in line with the ERG.
Oh dear. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. I didn't start tweeting until a year after the referendum. Do listen, because we've discussed this before. I know you're not a new caller, but you're a wrong caller. Thank you, and good night. Philip in Stansted, I hope you will answer the question on was I and most of the ERG right to abstain from the vote rather than inventing silly stories.
Yeah, I think you're totally correct to do that. It does strengthen our hand, because without that, we might as well raise the white flag and just say thanks very much, bye-bye, we're back in it.
I agree. I mean, I think you have to say that if we don't get a reasonable deal, we're not giving you £39 billion for nothing. We have to have something that's acceptable to us. And that's, Philip, your money as well as mine, isn't it? It's taxpayers' cash.
You can understand why government contracts go way over budget, because they're not dealing with their own money. They're spending our money, and they don't really look at anything. And I think if we stay in, or if we don't get out on a no deal, we'll just keep paying and paying.
Yes, absolutely. And if we remain in, we would find that at the next multi-annual financial framework, which comes up for discussion fairly soon, begins in 2021, the amount they'd be asking from us would be even greater than it currently is. So the figure would go up more. And British taxpayers have to stump up for the failures of the Eurozone, don't they?
Yeah. Can I ask you one question?
Yes, of course. Please, fire away.
Would you and Nigel Farage ever consider forming a party, and if every Brexiteer sent 10 quid to start it, would that be enough?
Well, I think if everybody who voted for Brexit sent in £10, we'd be rolling in money. I think be lavish. I hope that Nigel, who I have a high regard for and I think has been very important in delivering the referendum and indeed delivering the vote to leave, I'd love it if he were to rejoin the Conservative Party. And I understand he's reluctant to at the moment, and I see his reasons for it. But I would like to see a time when the Tory Party delivers properly on its manifesto commitments and on the referendum, and that Nigel would feel comfortable in rejoining. I think he's always managed to keep on the right side of reasonableness of British politics. He has always put his arguments fairly and clearly. We have to be careful of what UKIP has now mutated into, where it's moving towards a more extreme form. And that isn't normal for British politics, which is why, of course, Nigel has had to disassociate himself from it. So I'd love Nigel to come back to the Tory party. If he's listening, dear Nigel, please come back. There is a home for you here, but I understand that you may not want to, at least until Brexit's sorted out. So anyway, Philip, thank you very much for calling. We've had a text from Roy, who says you did the right thing. Anyone who disagrees simply doesn't want to leave the EU. But do you know if the PM has an end game plan, or is she just plodding along, hoping for some miracle deal to land on her table? That's a very good question, Roy. Perhaps if the Prime Minister's listening, she could answer, or her press office could answer, because it's very hard to work out whether there is a clear plan or whether it's all day-to-day management. But let's go to Michael in Belfast. Michael, very nice to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the question about whether the ERG was right to abstain yesterday?
Hello, Jacob. I'm actually delighted to speak to you because I've been following the Brexit now for quite some time. The ERG, I thought, absolutely correct. Absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, because sort of watching it from Belfast, we're sort of used to people, telling us one thing and doing another. The ERG stuck to their guns and did what they said. So absolutely, 100%.
Well, I thought it was very difficult to vote for a motion that was in favour of ruling out a no-deal Brexit when we'd kept on saying that a no-deal Brexit was an essential part of the negotiation. So thank you for your support, Michael.
No problem. And I think actually, a lot of people are sort of like being told one thing and the Prime Minister's doing something else. And to be honest, I think just looking at it, it's nice to have politicians that actually do what they say. So absolutely, the ERG were correct.
Well, that's a great compliment. Thank you for calling. I hope you'll call again. We've had a tweet come in from Scott, who also agrees the ERG was right to go against the government, but why has it taken so long? This kind of opposition should have happened over a year ago. Well, all I'd say is that we defeated the government by 230 votes on the withdrawal agreement, and last year it was crucial to support the government in getting the withdrawal bill to become the Withdrawal Act, so we set the date of the 29th in stone. But it's now 6:30. You're listening to Jacob Rees-Mogg, and it's time for the news with Lisa As Is. Oh, welcome back. There's been a lot of President Trump in the news today. First of all, he is now going to build a wall. He's going to use executive powers to say there's a state of emergency, to use money that would otherwise go to the military to build the wall, and he's going to do that without having approval from Congress. But perhaps more relevantly for the United Kingdom, and in a significant boost to my friend and parliamentary neighbour Liam Fox, the US has agreed a mutual recognition agreement on conformity assessment, an MRA with the United Kingdom. Now, what on earth does that mean? It means that goods made in the UK can be sold in the US and vice versa, with less bureaucracy for manufacturers and exporters, that it's essentially recognising that both sides make goods to reasonable standards. But he's gone further. He's welcomed this as Mr. Trump and said that trade between the two countries is going to grow very, very substantially after Brexit. He said trade links have been strengthened by the signing of the deal and that he was looking forward to having a very good trading relationship. And that's after previously warning Mrs. May that her deal could harm business links. So I just wonder whether, if he were to call in, he would think that I and most of the ERG were right to abstain in the vote that took place yesterday and which saw the government defeated because it was proposing ruling out no deal in the motion. But let's go to Robert in Norwich. Robert, what are your views? Do you think we made the right decision? And do you think Mr. Trump is going to open up trade with us?
I wasn't expecting to ask about Mr. Trump and trade.
Well, don't worry. You can stick to the ERG and abstaining.
Yes. What I was going to ask is, I was just looking at the figures, 259 or 258 versus 303 voting yesterday, and 67 abstaining from the Conservative Party. What I don't quite understand is why didn't the ERG vote against the motion? Surely that would help Theresa May strengthen her hand further, would it not?
Well, it's really a question of balance and parliamentary manners, in a sense, that it's quite something to vote against your own party on a three-line whip, and by and large one wants to give the government as much leeway as possible, and therefore it seemed, to put it in this way, politer to abstain, not go along with something that we were strongly opposed to, and knew that if we abstained in significant numbers, could not get passed. So that was why we abstained.
So making the point, but not rubbing salt in the wound, would be another way of putting it, perhaps.
That's a very good way of putting it, yes, I agree with that.
Yes.
So do you think we were right, and do you think we made a boo-boo?
No, I think you're right. I, like you, belong to the Conservative Party. I also have helped distribute leaflets in Norwich, because we're very keen. This is a number of people from Vote Leave. We've kept in touch with each other, and we're very keen to see Brexit delivered. I voted in the 75 referendum, and if I'd known then we're going to end up with a 28-member state heading towards federalisation, with a euro that, in the words of Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize-winning economist in the United States, is an utter failure because it's damaged trade, it's pushed up unemployment. There's no way I would have voted for it, but I was a bit young and innocent in those days, and I believed it was all about the price of eggs, milk and butter, and not actually a charade to drag us into a federation.
Well, you're right about the euro. The eurozone, 1997 to 2017, has seen economic growth of, I think, 26% against 46% for the UK. So not being in the eurozone has been an enormous advantage, and it shows essentially that the more Europe you have, the worse you're likely to do. Anyway, Robert, thank you so much for your call and for your support. I'm now going to go to Andrew in Ealing. Andrew, do you think the ERG was right to abstain in the vote, or what would you have liked us to do?
I think you were absolutely right in supporting the Prime Minister's position, and the Prime Minister's position has always been no deal is better than a bad deal. And the motion was the exact antithesis of that, in effect, that any deal is better than no deal. So I cannot understand why people are calling you traitors and treacherous when you simply supported the Prime Minister's own position.
Well, you're quite right. You can't really commit treason for supporting the Prime Minister's previous statements. You're also right that a couple of weeks ago we were whipped to vote against a motion saying that no deal should be ruled out, and then yesterday we were whipped to vote for a motion that said no deal should be ruled out, and that seemed an unusual position for the government to take and perhaps lacking in consistency.
And that's what scares me. It makes the Prime Minister look weak, feeble and flimsy if she has changed her position on this. And I think she needs to make her position clear. Is it still that no deal is better than a bad deal? And if that is the case, she needs to say it straight.
Well, I think the good news is that no deal is the law, both by the Withdrawal Act and by the Article 50 Act. So unless the law is physically changed by the 29th of March, we will leave with or without a deal. So I think that's a good, solid base. Anyway, Andrew, thanks so much for calling. I'm now going to go to Timothy in Lancaster, County Durham. And Timothy, you're a new caller, so welcome to LBC for the first time.
Thank you very much, Jacob.
What would you like to say on this issue?
Yeah, I totally agree with the ERG on that. Now, I voted to come out of the EU, but initially I thought a soft Brexit would probably be the best. As time's gone on, I'd sooner have a no deal and just get out of there. The way they behave generally, I think, is pretty appalling. Also, studying it, they're actually a sinking ship. The thing's full of holes. We'd be better off getting on the no-deal lifeboat and getting out of there before it takes us down with it, in my opinion.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right, that the problems in the Eurozone are still there, that the downturn in the economies is very serious, and we should be sailing in a different direction as quickly as possible. I think we're absolutely spot on.
And just another little thing. I used to work at Eton College, by the way.
Oh, did you?
Yes, I certainly did. We've moved up north now, but I spent 11 years there on the maintenance.
Oh, when was that?
I was a metal worker.
When was that?
It was actually from 1990 to 2001.
Oh, well, you just missed me.
I just missed you, yeah.
I left in 1987. Well,
yeah.
Timothy, thank you for calling, and I hope you'll call again. We're going to go to Cornelius in Antwerp before we go to the news. Cornelius, what's your view of the ERG's abstention?
Well done. You've done, obviously, the right thing. Because what I don't seem to understand, and I watched Question Time with the government every Tuesday, Wednesday on YouTube, etc. We are still under negotiations until the last minute of leaving the EU. And I do not understand how people can take a no deal off the table while we're still trying to get the best deal for the United Kingdom. I find it ludicrous. And I think you've done everything correct. Everything correct. And rightly so.
Thank you very much. Out of interest, what takes you to Antwerp?
Good question. Well, first of all, I am British. I'm from the UK. I came to Antwerp 2 years ago. I'm an engineer in the oil industry. And I came to Antwerp to do a project for an American oil company. I'd worked in the oil industry for nearly 35 years in different countries all over the world. And when I listened to Parliament talking about the UK keeping in line with European standards, etc., the industry that I work in the oil industry and electrical and instrumentation installations, the highest standards on the planet are UK standards.
Oh, yes, indeed.
And I will argue it with anybody. And I do not understand why they keep talking about staying in line with European standards, like as if Britain hasn't got any standards of their own.
Absolutely. Well, Cornelius, thank you very much for your call. I'm glad to say now that the ERG can boast international support for what it did yesterday, so that's much appreciated. And John agrees too. The ERG was absolutely correct in the way they voted. You all reflect the will of 17.4 million voters. However, a no deal would be better, in my opinion, than any deal. People who disagree, please call in, because we haven't had many of you so far. But in the meantime, it's Jacob Rees Mogg on LBC at 6:45, and time for the news headlines with Lisa As Is. Well, I hope that lullaby didn't send you all to sleep. If it did, I'm now going to try and jolt you back to wakefulness by asking the question about whether or not the ERG was right to back the government yesterday. Susie texts not to back the government, to abstain yesterday. Ruling out no deal is the most ridiculous suggestion ever. These Remainers have obviously never heard of leverage. You and your colleagues did the right thing yesterday. And Mike tweets, if the Conservative Party had all got fully behind a full, clean Brexit FTA, free trade agreement, they would have been in power for years to come, as they would have backed the people and the people would have rewarded them. Mike, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I agree with that it's what people essentially wanted when they voted. But let's now go to Jason in Bournemouth, who is a new caller. Jason, welcome.
Pleasure to speak to you, Jacob. Big, massive fan of yourself.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Good of you to call. I love Bournemouth. We used to go there for the Tory Party conference, and it was always a wonderful place to be, but sadly we don't get there anymore.
Beautiful place. Still like one of the traditional English places of the country now.
Anyway, let's get down to business. Do you think I and most of the ERG were right to abstain from the vote yesterday?
I do, Jacob. I think you're holding Theresa May to account and letting her know that you're not going to let her get away with, just sliding us off on one,
Absolutely.
Also, Jacob, if I may, like I say, big fan of yourself. I just wonder why you buy into this thing about Tommy Robinson being an extremist. Well, as you said yourself, he would do very well in elections. So what you're saying is a lot of people would back him. So by buying into this, this left-wing propaganda, you are offending quite a lot of your own fans, Jacob.
Well, I always think that I have to say what I believe to be true. And I think that's one of the reasons some people agree with me on other subjects, that they feel that what I say is what I actually think, rather than what is said to appeal to the crowds. And I think that's important in politics. And I'm afraid I do think Mr. Robinson...
He highlights a lot of important things that are going on in the country that are hidden by quite a lot of the mainstream media.
I think there are some things that different people highlight that need to be looked at. And I'm a great believer in free speech, and I think people ought to be able to highlight things whether I agree with them or not. But I think he is an extremist, and his record is one of extremism and advocating extreme issues. And actually, I think the polity in this country has been one of considerable stability that has usually been flexible enough to represent the interests of people. If we fail to deliver on Brexit, I think the politicians will have so separated themselves from the people that it would become an arena for the growth of extremism. And I think that's really very risky. That's why I think the Cooper-Bowles amendment is so unwise, because it will achieve precisely the opposite of what they really want. So that's my view. Of course, he is entitled to express his views, and free speech is important, but that equally people are right to point out that some of his views are quite extreme. So thank you for that. I'm now going to go to Nick in Radlett. Nick, hello.
Good evening, how are you?
Well, thank you, and you?
Yeah, well, thank you.
Where's Radlett, just out of interest? Where is Radlett?
Hertfordshire, just near Boreham Wood.
Oh, okay, yes, I know, broadly.
Watford, that way?
Yeah, very nice area of the country.
How did the DUP vote yesterday?
The DUP voted with the government yesterday.
So here's where I have a problem. It's a question, I guess, because you're better versed in this than I am. If we do leave without a deal, and from a negotiation point of view, I understand why that's relevant. But if we leave without a deal, my understanding, and we don't go into this Morehouse solution of having a 2-year standstill, my understanding is that will, by its very nature, mean there'll have to be a hard border on the Irish in Ireland. Is that correct?
I don't think it is, because somebody would have to put up this hard border, and all three sides, the UK, the Irish government and the EU, has said that it won't insist upon a hard border.
So you're going to have one country in the European Union, one outside the European Union, and free trade between them, notwithstanding there'll be different regulatory burdens, different tariffs, etc.
Well, it depends what you mean by a hard border, but if by a hard border you mean checks physically at the border and border infrastructure, that would not be necessary. You would have different standards and people would be required to meet them to sell products legally in each other's countries. But bear in mind, there is already a policed border in Ireland and between the Republic and Northern Ireland for excise duty, for VAT and so on. So it's just not policed physically at the border.
Because my big concern about the path we're going down is Jeremy Corbyn. Because, and this is the core to the question, would you rather see a no-deal Brexit, WTO, which leads to a border in Ireland, whether it's hard or however it is, which means potentially, the support of the DUP, the government lose that, and we end up, potentially with a Jeremy Corbyn government, which to me is the most dangerous thing that could come out of all of this.
Okay.
I just wonder whether you would put how you reconcile the potential of a Corbyn government with a no-deal Brexit and a border on the island of Ireland.
The DUP will withdraw its support from the government if there is a border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That is their major issue, and the reason in the vote yesterday had two sides to it. One was to remove the Irish backstop, which the DUP is strongly in favour of, and the other was to rule out a no-deal Brexit. And the DUP thought that changing the backstop was of overwhelming importance and more important than the type of deal, so therefore supported the government. The issue of the Irish border is there already is one, and that will remain whether we have a deal or no deal or any other thing you can imagine. Even if we remained, there is still a border, and different rules apply on either side of that border. So the DUP is going to support the government in the event that there's no division between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Jeremy Corbyn's best chance of being elected is in the event that we don't deliver on Brexit. That's what all the polling seems to say, because about 70% of Conservative voters want to leave. But we've got a caller from San Francisco. Daniel, you're a new caller. The international reach of LBC is now quite amazing that you should be calling from so far away. But Daniel, please go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to say that I think President Trump, the author of Art of the Deal, would absolutely approve of the ERG's hardline negotiation tactics, keeping no deal on the table. And furthermore, while he is not, unfortunately, a strong advocate for free trade, I think Mr. Trump nevertheless would pursue ever closer economic ties with the UK post-Brexit, because it will be mutually advantageous for both countries. And unlike the Eurozone, it will be a perfect partnership because it will allow both countries to gain economic advantages without sacrificing any autonomy.
Well, I think you're right, and I don't know if you know this, but there's a wonderful anomaly that the Department of Commerce says that the US has a trade surplus with the UK, and the Office for National Statistics says that the UK has a trade surplus with the US. So both sides, according to their official statisticians, are happy, which I think is a terrific state to be in.
Indeed.
Well, Daniel, thank you very much for calling. Dario texts, should there not now be a motion to make the revoking of Article 50 unlawful, as the language used and votes obtained in the triggering of Article 50 are technically legally binding? Surely this would sufficiently focus minds. And Peter texts, we must leave on WTO because if we remain tied in some way to the EU, then parliamentary sovereignty as we know it will eventually disappear. That is why I fail to understand why many MPs cannot see that. Well, thank you, everybody. It is time for me to wrap up. It's Jacob Rees Mogg on LBC. It's every Friday evening from 6 o'clock. But coming up at 10 o'clock tonight, it's Nick Abbott. Next, it is the inestimable Andrew Pearce on a subject I know not what, but it's bound to be interesting.
You say all the nicest things, Jacob. Now, coming up in the next 3 hours, we'll be talking about Donald Trump, Mexico, the border wall. He's taking emergency powers to build it.